Welcome to episode 10 of the 99 Forever podcast. I'm Eric Friesen, and joining me tonight on the show is hockey analyst and creator of the BlueBulletReport.com, Brad McPherson. Brad, thanks for taking the time to talk some Oilers hockey with me tonight.
Thanks for having me, Eric.
Yeah, I've been wanting to have you on for a bit now. We've chatted a few times on Twitter, and it's kind of an interesting week to be talking hockey, considering the league looks like it'll be shut down for a while now.
Yeah, it's been a very interesting day in the world of sports, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's larger issues at play, but for us diehard hockey fans that love the Oilers so much, it's going to be kind of weird to go without watching any games for the next little while.
Yeah, it kind of makes you think back to the last lockout, where everybody was watching poker on TV.
Yeah, exactly. I'm wondering how Sportsnet's going to fill all their time slots now. Maybe they'll start going to more junior hockey games, which might actually not be the worst for you because that's sort of an area of expertise in your field.
True, very much.
But before we get into any Oiler prospect talks, I just would like to find out a little more about you and your background, either watching and playing hockey. And I just want to know, when did you start following the game and become a fan of the Oilers?
Oh, got to be back in the 80s, I guess. So Wayne Gretzky was my introduction to hockey in the mid-80s when I started watching. So basically, I think 1988 Stanley Cup run is kind of the first one I really remember as a kid, back when I was about 6 years old. And that's kind of when I really became a big Oilers fan and started playing.
Yeah, because I was born 6 months after the Gretzky trade, so I basically missed out on the entire dynasty. I was alive for the 90 Cup, but I was only a year and a half old, so it's pretty hard to appreciate it at that age. But no, I haven't had too many of my guests on who can really recall that era. So, do you still have any memories from that end of the dynasty run, or is it just kind of general memories, or can you actually remember specific games that you were at or cool things that you saw?
Not too many games. Well, I didn't go to my first game till 1990. Would have been my first one against the North Stars. But previously, like one of my earliest memories are like a lot of the hockey games, like say in the playoffs. The games would go past my bedtime, so I'd go off to sleep. My dad would record it on video cassette and get to watch the next day. So like we had like the 1988 Game 4 against the Flames where Gretzky comes down the wing and does the slap shot over Vernon's glove hand. Had that one on tape for years. Used to watch that.
And Glenn Sather kind of turns around and gives it to the Flames fans at the Dome.
Exactly.
Yeah, I guess that would be one of the probably most memorable ones for someone from your era who was watching at that time. But yeah, like I didn't start really following hockey until 96, 97 when I was, around 7, 8 years old. So my earliest Oiler memory is the Todd Marchant overtime winner in Dallas. But yeah, it's kind of cool to hear some people who can actually remember the glory days, because that's just the greatest era in Oilers hockey. And like you said, you just kind of caught the tail end of it. But do you actually remember the Gretzky trade? I'm sure as a young kid, it might not have hit you as hard as it did some adults. But what do you remember from that summer?
I remember from that summer, like not long before. I can't remember if it was the summer before that or the same summer. I remember even seeing. I was at a Eskimo game against, I think it was Hamilton, and Gretzky and his wife Janet came down into the stands where we were sitting. So that was like my only experience of ever meeting or seeing him in person during that era. And then I remember more how much hatred was on for Pocklington after the trade. People like making. I remember people like doing burnings and other things to simulate. Basically killing Pocklington. Like the hatred was just crazy. But yeah, it didn't hit me as much, being only like I think 7 at the time.
So when the Oilers were winning their fifth cup in 1990, and they went to the conference final again in 91 and 92. Your recollection of those series, I'm guessing, is probably a little better because you were more into your middle grades by then.
Yeah, 1990. I remember that was one I really remember watching a lot of. I was quite into that one. And then, yeah, 91 and 92. I remember, yeah, both of those losing to the North Stars when you were kind of the favorites going into that series. I remember that one. And then 92 was an interesting one because that was after the Messier trade, and there was a lot of turnover with the team. So a lot of the dynasty guys were gone by then.
And then for the next 4 years, they didn't make the playoffs. So I don't remember that era because I wasn't watching at the time. Obviously, that wasn't as bad as the decade of darkness that came quite a bit later. But were those kind of lean years to be an Oilers fan in the mid 90s before they really took off again with Waite and Smith leading the way in the late 90s?
Yeah, the buildings were definitely emptier. I remember that. People were, I know, disenfranchised with Pocklington and the team, and then I remember, yeah, not being in school and being an Oilers fan, and a lot of kids weren't big Oilers fans. I remember, or they had switched to the Kings. And there's a lot of people that were big Kings fans with their new gray and black jerseys, and Gretzky being there. So.
See, I'm glad you said that because I have a friend in Calgary, and when I was going to university there, they would tell me about in the Flames' lean years, say the late '90s, early 2000s, when they were consistently missing the playoffs, even with Iginla, that a lot of Flames fans were switching over and not going to games. So it almost became like not cool to be a Flames fan at that time because they were just missing the playoffs every year, and they were cheering for teams like Detroit, Colorado, Dallas. So you're saying you were seeing a similar thing with kids in your class or kids who liked hockey that you knew at that time in the mid 90s in Edmonton?
Exactly. Yeah. It wasn't cool to be an Oilers fan.
Well, I think it's kind of shifted its way around after a lot of lean years, and hopefully we're going to have playoffs. It might not start on time this year, but hopefully we're going to get them down the road. I guess one last thing I want to ask you about your days growing up. Who were a couple of your favorite players? I'm going to guess Gretzky is one because you mentioned him, and he's my hero as well. I think your profile picture, is that Bill Ranford?
That is Bill Ranford. Yeah, a big fan of his. Like the 1990 Stanley Cup is the one that really jumps out to me. And Bill Ranford. Yari Curry was another one favorite of mine, and Esa Tikkanen I was a big fan of too.
And I think you said you just barely met, or you maybe were in the vicinity of Gretzky at that game. But have you had a chance to ever meet any Oilers players over the years? Just
not. I've met some. I did get to meet Gretzky not too long ago. He did an autograph signing at West Edmonton Mall. So got his new book autographed there. So you got to meet him for about a minute before you moved on to the next person.
I think I remember seeing that online, that he was at a Chapters or something.
Yeah, it was. He did the signing at the Ice Palace, and then you had to be at Chapters before be the first. I can't remember 150 in line by like 6 a.m.
Okay. Yeah, I mean that's my ultimate dream in terms of meeting a sports hero, is to meet Wayne Gretzky. I've been in the same room as him once. He came here for a charity dinner about 10 years ago, and it was him and Gordie Howe being interviewed on stage by Stephen Harper. And it was a really cool event to go to, and I'm glad I got to at least be in the same area as him, even though I didn't get that close. But no, that's cool that you got to meet the greatest Oiler and the greatest player of all time. And I guess I'll transition a little more over to your scouting now, because you are a prospect analyst, and I'm just kind of curious how long you've been running the Blue Bullet Report, where the name originated from, and has looking into prospects always been kind of an interest of yours?
So Blue Bullet Report's been around. Let's see, it's been about 4 years now. been running it online. And the name because actually from my playing days, one of my I used to wear a blue helmet. I played on a team with our colors were blue, so for some reason I got nicknamed the Blue Bullet from.
That's not a bad nickname.
Except I wasn't the fastest skater, so I don't know if they were just being ironic or
It was like an ironic nickname, like when they call a giant guy tiny.
yeah. But yeah, 2015. I've been doing the Blue Bullet report.
That's a good
But
time to start with.
that I would say early 2000s when I started getting really into following the draft and trying to play around with doing my own rankings and things of that nature. And really, I'd say was it 2007 I started doing my own rankings and posting them on Low Tide and things of that nature. So
Okay.
that's where you would find my earlier work, whereas back in the day was either on Low Tide or on message boards like HF boards back when everybody used to be on that.
So when you're looking into prospects, how do you kind of compile your list? Do you sort of just look at what all the experts' opinions are and then try to cross those lists and put it together yourself? Is there a lot of watching highlights of these kids, or what goes into actually putting together your list? Because I believe it was in February you brought out your top 31.
Yeah. So most of it is just based. I have a draft model I created, and so it doesn't involve any of my own scouting. I used to go over reading reports and trying to like do my own analysis of that. But I've decided since then I'm not really a scout, so I leave that to the experts, and I just take their information based on their rankings plus the statistical measurements I've created on my own, and kind of I like to say I'm looking for where scouting and stats collide, and that's where you can find the best results. I think for players is finding where the stats say the player looks like a good prospect and where the scouts are also saying.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I guess if we look back at the Oilers' most recent draft class, it was headlined by Philip Broberg, but they also got Raphael Lavoie in that draft class, and he's been producing well at the Quebec level for the the season, especially after the trade. Can I just get a quick thought from you on some of the Oilers prospects that have recently joined the system last summer?
Yeah, Broberg wasn't as high on my list as he was for the Oilers. I had him ranked 17th. I was more, I liked more players like I had Zegras and like Caulfield were the two forwards that I was hoping that the Oilers were going to target. Broberg, but it is tough to tell with Swedish defensemen. There's been a lot of good Swedish defensemen drafted outside of the top 10 that have turned out better than expected. You can just see how Clefbaum's developed, and Broberg producing at a similar rate, or actually a little bit better offensively at the same age than Clefbaum. So it's hard to judge with some of those European defensemen. So we'll have to wait and see. But he's probably need another year in at least Sweden or the AHL. Or probably, I wouldn't expect him in the Oilers for at least another 3 years, or 2 to 3 years.
That's what I figured. I mean, especially because he was so young when they drafted him too, right? And I kind of thought that if he wasn't going to come over this year, he wanted to play another year in Sweden instead of going to play in the OHL for Hamilton, that he might be coming over next season to play for Bakersfield, and his contract would still slide, right? Because he'll be under 20. So they're not burning a year. But you're starting to think that it would be more wise to leave him in Sweden for another season instead of bringing him over to Bakersfield next year.
Either or would be fine. But I don't expect him to be on the Oilers blue line for I would say following Clefbaum's development would probably be a similar pattern, though I know Clefbaum did have some injury problems earlier in his career too. So
And
yeah, Clefbaum, he played, what was it, 2 years in Sweden, then came and played 1 year in the AHL, and then saw a cup of coffee that season as well with the Oilers, and then became a full-time Oiler 4 years after being drafted. So
that's right.
I'd say that's probably the best case scenario for Broberg, would be something similar.
And the other thing is that the Oilers' left side is pretty solidified right now, I'd say. I mean, they're probably looking to trade Chris Russell this summer, and not just to free up cap space, which would be a huge asset, but just because their left side isn't too bad right now, especially with Clefbaum, Nurse, and Jones as your top three. It'd be pretty hard for Broberg to break into that at the moment.
True. And then the other prospect is, like you mentioned, is Lavoie, and I had him ranked 24th overall, so I was quite pleased when he dropped to the Oilers. And big 6'4", right shot winger, has a good shot. So yeah, he looks like somebody that could really is somebody that the Oilers need in the system for sure.
And aside from all the point streaks he's had this year and winning gold with Canada at the World Juniors, he was just an absolute stud in the playoffs last year, scoring 20 goals in the playoffs. I mean, that's huge production, and led his team to a Memorial Cup final and a league final, of course. They lost both, unfortunately, but really impressive play from him in the most important time of the year. Yet there are still a lot of scouting reports that question his consistency, and I don't know if his work ethic has been questioned as well by more than a couple. But is that a concern to you? Do you think that that's the reason he dropped, is because he can go games where he's not as noticeable? Because you'd think that a guy who's scoring that much in the playoffs and consistently a 30-goal scorer in the Quebec League would be a first-round pick.
Yeah, true. And I thought he should be as well. And but sometimes, yeah, I think you're right in saying that consistencies, work ethic is maybe questioned with Lavoie, but it may be also sometimes there's a big man syndrome where a 6'4" guy doesn't look like he's working as hard as, say, a 5'10" guy. So
Not the same as Leon Draisaitl, how people are always saying that he's lazy, even though it's just. I've heard other people say it's just that's because he's not moving his legs a million miles a minute. It doesn't look like he's skating as hard as he possibly could. And then you got a guy like Kyler Yamamoto whose legs are half as long, and he's chugging a million miles a minute, and it looks like he's just working every second he's on the ice.
True.
So it's kind of maybe unfair to Leon, especially considering he's almost certainly going to win the Art Ross. Should win the Hart this year as well. But we talked a little bit about the possible developmental plan for Broberg. What do you see as Lavoie's next 2 or 3 years in terms of eventually graduating to the Oilers?
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. Well, his development in the AHL, you'll have to see how his scoring, how it translates to the next level and what he has to work on. But usually it takes a good I'm expecting at least 2 years probably in the AHL before considering moving him up. I don't see a rush on trying to move him up too quickly. So yeah, I'd figure about at least 2 years in the AHL would be good for his development. You look at somebody like Tyler Benson, how long he's been down there. Even Yamamoto, he should have never been rushed to the NHL. And then you see Puljujarvi, and there's no reason to try and push these guys too quickly.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And also, because the Oilers have been in a playoff spot for basically the entire season, which has been nice. I haven't followed the draft as closely as I usually do, but if the Oilers end up picking somewhere around 20 to 23 overall, do you have 1 or 2 names that you think could be potential targets for them this year? Because I'm thinking that they would be looking at a forward for sure, if not forward in the first and second round. But after going so heavy on defense in the first round the last 2 years, I figured that this will be the year they try to add some more talent up front. And I just wanted to get a thought from you on a couple players who could be future Oiler players that you see.
Yeah, it's definitely a good year for drafting a forward. There's a lot of good forwards available in the top 25. If I look at my draft rankings I put out in February, if you look at the top 23 players on my list, 20 of them are forwards. There's only 2 defensemen and 1 goalie. So it's definitely a forward-heavy draft, and it's a deep draft, so there's a lot of good prospects available. So you have players like Jack Quinn, who's lighting up the OHL.
I've heard his name a few times, yeah.
And he's somebody that I have him ranked 18th overall, and where is he now? He has 52 goals in 62 games this year with the Ottawa. Seth Jarvis in the WHL, he's been lighting it up, and I think I expect him to start shooting up the rankings. I had him 20th in February, and if I put out another draft ranking, he'd probably be my top 15 with the production. In the second half of the season for him has been crazy. He's been over 2 points a game, I believe. Playing with Portland. Yeah, he's up to 98 points in 58 games with Portland. So those are a couple of guys off the top of my head, but there's a lot of guys. There's Yannick Perreault's son Jacob is available in this year. He's playing in the OHL. And then one out of where there's Lucas Reichel, who is the nephew of Robert Reichel, if you remember him.
Yeah.
And he's playing in the German, in the DEL, which is I think they believe they shut down their league for the season. And he has 24 points in 42 games playing in the top league in Germany, which is a pretty good season. So there's a lot of interesting names out there. Dawson Mercer, Maverick Bourque, the Quebec League. So there's a lot of options at forward definitely available for the Oilers. And all of these guys, I would say, would have top 6 potential. More likely second line wingers than first line, but
okay. And what chance do you think that the Oilers will have to pick from most of those names that you said if they end up picking in the early 20s? Do you expect many of them will be off the board, or are these going to be guys who are reasonably you can expect that should be there when Edmonton steps to the podium?
I think there should be probably at least 3 or 4 of them available. There's, for example, every year I do a top 100 ranking, and there has never been a season where all 100 players have gone in the 217 picks of the draft. So there's always guys skipping through the draft that you think should be drafted even in the first 3-4 rounds. So it's interesting how widely the draft can range. But there's definitely going to be a good forward available in the Oilers pick for sure.
And that's, I think, something that a lot of Oiler fans will be very excited to hear, because with the absolute superstars they have leading the charge, if they can start adding with a few more skilled guys like Yamamoto around the edges and fill in, then this core has the chance to really do some damage and push for a cup in the next 3 to 5 years. But I guess one name that kind of stood out was Jack Quinn. I believe, I'm trying to remember if it was Low Tide's show or Bob Stauffer's show, that a scout had come on and talked about him. I'm just curious why a 50-goal scorer wouldn't be higher up in the draft than, say, 20th or in the late teens. Is it because he's a late birth date, or he plays on a strong team and they're kind of thinking, well, maybe his points are because he plays with a bunch of other skilled players? I just wanted to get an opinion from you on why you think he isn't a top 5 pick, for example.
Yeah, part of it I think is the thought that if he is on a strong team, some people wonder how much is playing with Marco Rossi, who's going to be a likely top 10 pick in the draft. He's putting up 120 points in 56 games this year for Ottawa, and Quinn gets the benefit of playing with him. So part of it, I would assume, is that.
Is Rossi a 2021 prospect or 2020?
He's 2020.
Okay. I couldn't remember if he was an 03 born or not.
He's born in 01. So he was 8 days from being in last year's draft, actually.
Gotcha.
Yeah, he's somebody I have him, I think, 7th on my list. So getting to play with one of the top players in the draft is one of the reasons. But yeah, other than that, I think part of it's just the depth in this year's draft. There's a lot of good players available. So,
well, Brad, now looking at the players who are actually on the Oilers roster that they've drafted and developed themselves, I think one who really stands out this year is Kyler Yamamoto. He's probably been among the Oilers' best players since New Year's Eve with 26 points in 27 games and really fit in well on the, you could even maybe call it the top line. I was going to say the second line with Leon Draisaitl and Ryan Nugent-Hopkins. What have been your thoughts on Yamamoto this year after you said earlier they kind of rushed him a little bit, but now that he's kind of finally found his footing at the NHL level, just a thought from you on his progression, and also what were your opinions on him when the Oilers drafted him in 2017?
Yeah, I've been a little bit surprised by how well he's done. Like I've always been a big fan of Yamamoto, but I wasn't expecting like a point per game player, especially after not reaching those levels this year in the AHL. But he's been quite the pleasant surprise at the pro level. But I always expected him to be have the ability to be a top 6 forward. Back in 2017, I had him 15th overall on my draft model. So he was also the top player available in the Oilers pick. So I was quite happy with the Oilers pick of him. So for instance, like one of the things I use in my draft model is I've developed a formula that kind of projects a player's offensive upside for a forward from the CHL, based on correlation between players' production in their draft season, based on their points per game, their age, percentage of team scoring. I've looked at how that correlates to players who have played in the NHL 250 plus games, and through that, I've come up with a formula that kind of predicts offensive upside, and Yamamoto always did well at that. With that, for example, my point prediction model had him having an offensive upside of 0.84 points per game, which he's actually exceeding this year playing with Draisaitl and Nugent-Hopkins.
Now, is that in his prime, you're saying?
That's saying, his best season in the NHL. It was projecting him to be
that turns out to 69 points.
Exactly, yeah.
And I know this is a short sample size, and maybe he never gets back to a point per game player again. Maybe this is just the beginning of what's going to be for the next 10 years. It's hard to say. But is that still sort of where your opinion lies, that he'll be a high 60s player in terms of production year over year?
I'm thinking so. I think he definitely has that ability. He put up great numbers in the WHL, and players. There's definitely a correlation between scoring in your draft season and scoring in the NHL. Players that scored in junior tend to be scorers in the NHL level, and players that aren't tend not to suddenly become big scorers. There aren't too many late bloomers.
And I know he was another one of the older prospects when he was drafted in 2017. But if I'm not mistaken, his points per game average was among the best among CHL players that year.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you would think that a guy like that would be a top 10 pick for sure. I think there were rumors that LA was even looking at taking him about 10 picks before the Oilers were. So is it just a matter of that his size kind of hurt him in terms of where he was picked?
Yeah, I think if he was 5'11", say like Nick Suzuki was that year, I think he might have went a little higher.
Yeah, he was in the teens to Vegas, right?
Yeah, so he went.
I want to say 13th or 11th.
Yeah, 13. Yeah. So I could have seen him going a little higher, but yeah, he gets knocked down because of his size. Partially, his age might have been sometimes late birthdays or not seen as favorable as a younger player in the draft.
So, not to put you on the spot here, but if a redraft were to happen today, knowing what we know now, where do you think he would be picked? Like, how many guys, just looking at that 2017 class, do you think would still go ahead of him?
A good question.
You're my prospect guy. I have to give you all my prospect ones.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'd have to do an analysis of that, but
because Pettersson would probably be the top one, right?
Yeah, Pettersson. Heiskanen, Makar.
Yeah.
Escher would probably still go ahead of him.
But he might be pushing top 10. Is that fair to say then?
Yeah, that's fair to say. For sure.
Okay. And he's not the only prospect from the Oilers system to make the jump this year. We've also seen Bear and Jones make the team full-time. I guess Bear started the season with the Oilers. Jones came up halfway, just like he did last year, but hasn't looked back this season. Legason has played a few games. Benson played a few games due to injuries. Can I just get a thought from you on all four of those guys? And also, has this been the Oilers' best developmental year in decades?
Yeah, I can't remember a developmental year where so many players have made such a big impact on the team. And a lot of them have been a surprise, too. Like, for example, Bear, I don't think anybody saw him coming and being a top 4 defenseman for the Oilers and one of their best players. Jones was trending where he was actually ahead of Bear on a lot of people's prospects.
I think Lowtide was the first person who I saw doing that, because I was a big Bear supporter from the start. Maybe because he's another Saskatchewan kid like me, and also I thought that having a right shot defenseman who scored 13 goals in his draft year, that it doesn't make sense why this guy slipped to the 5th round, but that was a guy I always had belief in that could make it. But I think the common consensus that I started to see after Lowtide was the first one to put it out was that Jones' skating was going to get him there before Bear. So is that sort of what you were thinking as well?
That's what I was thinking as well. But yeah, Bear definitely he seems like a different defenseman after he talks about committing to eating better and his training and stuff. When I look at my 2015 rankings, I had Bear 90th overall back then, and that would have been pre my current draft model. So
they got him at 124, so not a bad pickup.
Yeah, I have a little note saying I didn't think he'd be more than a number 4 or number 5, but he looks like he's already a top 4, so he's definitely turned out better than I ever expected him to be.
Could we also see, I think I should have asked you this earlier too, but I think Evan Bouchard has the potential to be a top pairing guy. But could we see a scenario where Bear gets there first, and then over the next, I don't know, 3 to 5 years, it's Bouchard as the other right shot guy trying to take that spot away from Bear?
Yeah, I could definitely see that, and it's a good position to be in, and definitely a fan of Bouchard. I know I know that Sean Patrick Ryan, who is kind of my go-to with OHL stuff. He's called Evan Bouchard similar type player to John Carlson, And if we could get somebody like that as the other right shot defenseman on our top four, that's quite the pair to have up there.
Oh, yeah. I know Sean, and he actually used to have a podcast on this network on the Oilers Live channel that my show is now on. So I've been following his stuff for a while and talking to him. And I know you're giving Sean credit, but I'm going to give you a little credit now. I believe it was about a month ago I saw a tweet from you comparing, was it Carlson's AHL numbers to Bouchard's AHL numbers, saying that was probably his most reasonable comparison at this point in his development?
Yeah, there's other. I was just showing, how both of them have fared since kind of how they've trended from their junior to their AHL level and so on, and just showcasing that they're not only scouting comparables, but statistically they're comparable players as well. So he's definitely trending to being a top offensive defenseman at the pro level.
And one other question on Bouchard. I'm sort of losing my train of thought here for a sec. When it comes to his production, did you see him as a pick that the Oilers should have taken in 2018 as well? Was that the year to go for him, or was there another player in 2018 that you liked more? I know that there were talks of Wahlstrom, Noah Dobson. Just who was your pick for the Oilers at that time?
Oh, Wahlstrom was my top guy, but I'm kind of glad they did not go with my choice. Wallstrom's kind of he hasn't developed quite the way I expected. He did have a rough first year in the NCAA, and you can see now he's gotten a little bit of games in the NHL and playing. He has definitely had a bit of a bounce back season, but he still isn't as good as I was expecting him to be at the next level. So I'm quite happy that Bouchard was their choice over him. I did have Dobson right around the same. I had Bouchard at 8th and Dobson at 9th on my rankings, and pretty much as a pick'em between the two guys. I couldn't do wrong with either.
Because you're going with one guy like Dobson, who's the better puck carrier, but then you've got Bouchard, who has the amazing point shot and the passing ability, right? It's just it's a toss up, like you said.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you have the numbers in front of you, but based on your projections, how you were able to sort of decipher that Yamamoto might be a 68, 69 point guy, do you have an expectation for what we can reasonably expect from Bouchard when he reaches his peak in terms of points?
I don't have that exactly, but with defensemen, the way I found with defensemen how I rank them is I call it an adjusted point per game off of their numbers in the CHL. When I took a look at defensemen that have gone from juniors to the NHL, the power play points per games don't translate. They translate about at a rate of about 50%. So say a player in junior puts up a X amount of power play points per game. At the NHL level in their best season, it's maybe half of that.
So you cut it in half, whatever their best junior season. Okay.
Yeah. So with Bouchard, he has one of the best I've ever seen. He's up there with I think Ryan Ellis is the top one out of the ones I've done in the last 20 years, or done the numbers for. D'Angelo with the Rangers is up there. So he's definitely, in terms of junior numbers, his numbers were off the charts. And so he's definitely a player who, I wouldn't be surprised if he has 60-point potential at the NHL level.
That would be outstanding. And you'd think that when he's playing with, let's say, a 25-year-old Connor McDavid and a 26-year-old Leon Draisaitl, that he's going to get some power play points, right? Just just simply by being out there, he's going to get the last touch on a pass that's going to go to McDavid before sending that cross ice feed over to Draisaitl for the one-timer. So he's bound to rack up the points there. And maybe that's a little unfair because a lot of prospects don't have the benefit of playing with two superstars at the same time. So does that skew the numbers a little bit?
It could a little bit, but just with the Bouchard's game, like a big part of his game is just his playmaking and just getting making the smart, quick pass. So he's going to get a lot of points just from hitting McDavid in stride, hitting Draisaitl in stride, and just with his passing ability alone. Like when I look at his numbers in his draft season, he put up 54 points in 67 games at even strength. Like if you remove his power play scoring, he was almost a point per game defenseman. What was that? 0.81 points per game if you remove his power play scoring.
Okay. And I guess the last prospects I'll ask you about, just your thought on how far we'll see Tyler Benson and William Lagesson develop at the NHL level, and where you think these guys will be in their peak.
Well, with Benson, I did do a post on Blue Bullet where I was comparing him against other players who've had similar production from their draft season and then on to their AHL season. And a couple of the players I kind of mentioned as statistical comparisons were like Jarrett Stoll or Dave Bolin, Antoine Vermette. So that would be kind of like that would be kind of a hopeful upside for them as somebody to play maybe in your second or third line. I'd hope that he would get a few more games in the NHL this season. I'd made a point that an expectation for Benson this season would be 40 games played and about 12 points would be a reasonable season. He didn't hit that mark, but not all of them do. Brad Marchand in that season, at that same age, I think he had 1 point in 20 games in his.
Yeah, so it's not that we're writing him off as a potential second line player. He could still develop into that.
Yeah, there's definitely still the potential.
And for a guy like Lagesson, I think if he can be a really good number 7, then you're doing pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
So they do have some guys that are coming up, and I just think that with the forward, well, not as much of the forwards, but there are a few guys like you wonder if Maximov's going to get there when Lavoie gets there. There will be guys pushing for those spots. The whoever they draft this year, like there should be forwards who are going to challenge Benson, so that maybe that brings out the best in him, and maybe he just settles into a role as a skilled third line left winger, and I think that's fine too. But it's encouraging to see that we're really starting to see prospects turning into players, and that's something that the Oilers haven't done in a long time.
Yeah, it's nice to finally see that, for sure.
It must have been tough during the early 2010s ranking prospects and things like that, when basically the only player the Oilers were turning into actual players from the draft were the guys who they picked in the first round. Anything after that was like pretty slim pickings, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was definitely slim pickings. And then if they got somebody that was decent, like you see, like Tyler Pitlick, for example, just as he was starting, if it wasn't for injury problems, you wonder if they would have never let him go, kind of thing.
Yeah, he was having such a good run there. I think it was in the start of the 2016-17 season, and then an injury just completely took him out.
Yeah. But I can't. Other than that, there hasn't been. Yeah, there's been slim pickings. Guys haven't lived up to potential. You've like Magnus PRV and players are like that, and
Yeah, he was a guy I thought was really going to make it, and even a guy like Omar showed some flashes of skill, but just didn't have the rest of the game to make it at the NHL level.
Mm-hmm.
He's great for making YouTube highlights. That's
True.
I think that will be his claim to fame 10 years from now when he's signing autographs somewhere in Sweden. I guess the last thing I'd like to talk to you about before we wrap up for the day is probably the biggest news in the hockey world. We just briefly touched on it off the start of the show. The coronavirus ultimately causing the NHL they're using the word pause the league. So I'm glad to hear the word pause as opposed to cancel. But do you think we're going to take a month or two off and come back and end up playing the playoffs all the way to the end of July? Like, what are you thinking about the situation?
It's interesting. It's hard to know when the season will come back for sure. But if it's only say like 6 weeks or something like that, and then they're back playing, then I can definitely see them cutting the season short and going straight in the playoffs, whether it's a full 16 team playoffs or they decide to get creative. It'll be interesting to see. Maybe they just have 8 teams in it. Because it pushes everything else back. You got the draft, free agency, and then you got a quick turnaround to the next season. So I could imagine that cutting the playoffs even shorter. Maybe they'd only do 5-game series. It's going to be an interesting time for sure.
Yeah, it's really weird to see like what they're going to have to do to accommodate everything, because I'm sure the NHL awards have all been set and booked with where they'll be held in the draft. These are venues that have been scheduled time to do these events. Plus, like you said, is the Stanley Cup champions and the finalists only going to have a month off before training camp? If the Stanley Cup gets handed out right before August long weekend and they have to be back by the middle of September, it could really throw off the entire league. And I just hope they figure out some way to do it, because there's an uneven amount of games played. Certain teams have played more than others. Are they just going to go based on points percentage to settle who finishes where? And it wouldn't be the worst case for the Oilers, because I think they'd still finish in second place in the division even if they did that. Yeah. But it's so hard to say, isn't it, what's going to happen?
Yeah, it'd be interesting because, what is it? The most anybody's played is 71 games. Do they just have everybody play until they're at
one more game?
Yeah, like 72 games, and then just call it there so that everybody has the even amount of games, or is it just point percentage?
Now, because the Oilers are comfortably in a playoff spot, I'm fine with that. But let's say you're a team who's just on the outside of the wild card, and by saying, okay, you get 2 more games and you're 4 points out of the playoffs, well, that's probably a little tougher pill to swallow for those organizations, because now you're saying, well, I basically have to win my last 2 games to get in, and the teams in front of me can't get a single point.
Yeah, so, or do you have a play-in where,
right?
That'd be the other option.
That might be more fair. And and like I said, it doesn't really bother me one way or another, because the Oilers would be in a playoff spot regardless. But I think there would be some pushback from organizations who are just on the outside of the playoff picture and would miss because of that.
Yeah, I think it's Winnipeg that would just miss out on points percentage, if I remember hearing today. So, yeah, things like that.
Tough break for them. Well, Brad, I want to thank you so much for jumping on the podcast tonight, and I really hope that you'll come back again, maybe closer to the draft, and we can really dive into some deeper prospect talk about who the Oilers could be taking, and maybe not even just the first round, but the subsequent rounds as well.
That would be great.
And just before we wrap up, can you tell people where they can follow you and find your work for the Blue Bullet Report?
Yeah, you can find my work on bluebulletreport.com, or you can find me on Twitter. Those probably be the most common ways to find me. But yeah, all my work is on bluebulletreport.com. So yeah, if you're interested in the draft and checking out my rankings, I suggest you go there and take a look.
Awesome. Well, everyone, please check that out. And Brad, thanks again for talking hockey with me tonight.
You're welcome.
So for Brad McPherson, I'm Eric Friesen. This has been the 99 Forever podcast. We're out.
Oilers Live.